For 6 centuries, the God of Israel contended for the loyalty of his own people and watched their hearts drift toward a rival that should have been too small to matter. Israel did not fall first before chariots, seizure towers, or invading kings. It did not lose its soul first to Pharaoh, to Assyria, or to Babylon. It stumbled before a rain god, before an idol raised on hilltops, before a lord of storms whose promise was as old as hunger and as persuasive as fear. His name was Baal, and that alone should stop you. Because when most people imagine idolatry, they imagine something crude, something laughably false, something no sane nation could mistake for power. They imagine carved wood, mute as stone, blind ritual. But Israel's tragedy was not that it bowed to something obviously ridiculous. Its tragedy was that Baal offered what terrified people desire most when survival feels uncertain: food for the table, life for the children, fertility for the land, and the hope that tomorrow would not collapse into famine. That is what made him dangerous. Baal did not arrive in Israel's imagination as a philosopher's idea. He arrived as an answer to the oldest human panic. Will the ground yield? Will the sky open? Will the next season preserve us or bury us? He presented himself not as a distant mystery, but as a useful God, a practical God, a God who seemed to specialize in the urgent matters that keep families awake at night. He promised rain, and in the ancient world, rain was not romance. Rain was breath. Rain was bread. Rain was whether a mother had milk for her child and whether a father could look at an empty field without despair swallowing him whole. So understand this clearly. Israel was not tempted by Baal because Baal was greater than the Lord. Israel was tempted by Baal because Baal appeared more immediate. He seemed close to the soil, close to the season, close to the desperate arithmetic of harvest and hunger. He did not ask first for covenant, holiness, trust, or surrender. He offered results. Do this, and the clouds will answer. Perform the rite, and the earth will yield. Feed the God, and the God will feed you. That bargain is as old as rebellion and as modern as tomorrow morning. The humiliating truth of Israel's story is that the people chosen by the living God repeatedly turned aside, not because the Lord had failed to show his power, but because the human heart is always vulnerable to whatever looks controllable. An unseen God who demands faith can feel terrifying. A visible system that promises predictable return feels safer, even when it is false. And there is the wound at the center of this history. Israel did not merely chase pleasure, it chased security. It reached for a rival altar because a rival altar seemed easier to manage than a holy God. You can almost hear the rationalization forming in the villages and fields. Not open rebellion, not formal renunciation, only a quiet compromise, only a practical adjustment, only one more altar, one more offering, one more hedge against disaster. That is how a nation does not fall in battle, yet still begins to lose. And once that fear found a name, once that promise took shape in the figure of Baal, the contest for Israel's heart was no longer happening on distant borders. It had moved into the realm of bread, weather, survival, and trust. When Israel crossed the Jordan and stepped into Canaan, They did not merely enter a new land. They entered a new psychology. For 40 years in the wilderness, their survival had been shaped by direct dependence on God. Morning after morning, manna appeared. Water came from the rock. Their clothing did not wear out beneath the desert sun. They had lived inside a sustained miracle. A nation preserved not by agriculture, not by trade, not by irrigation, not by political alliances, but by the immediate hand of the Lord. Then that season ended. The wilderness had been harsh, but it had also been simple. Hunger came, and God answered. Thirst rose, and God provided. The people had known fear, but they had also known the pattern of divine intervention. Canaan was different. Canaan demanded another kind of trust, and that kind of trust felt far more frightening because it was tied to ordinary things: soil, seed, rain, waiting. Joshua records the moment with devastating quietness. The day after Israel ate the produce of the land, the manna ceased. No trumpet marked the change. No thunder rolled across the sky to announce that an era had closed. Yet everything had changed. The people who had eaten bread from heaven now had to break ground with their own hands. The people who had watched miracles fall at dawn now had to look upward and wait for clouds. And that is where the fear began to settle in. Because Canaan was not Egypt. Egypt had the Nile, faithful and predictable, flooding in its season, feeding canals and fields with a rhythm strong enough to sustain a civilization. Canaan had no such river. It lived by rain from heaven, early rains in autumn, latter rains in spring. If either failed, the consequences were merciless. Crops did not merely disappoint. They died. Vineyards withered. Olive trees failed. Sheep weakened. Children felt the hunger first in their bodies before the adults admitted the danger aloud. You must understand the weight of that world. There were no refrigerated storehouses, no aid convoys, no empire beyond the horizon prepared to send grain to a failing village. A ruined, rainy season was not an inconvenience to be managed with careful budgeting. It was a sentence of slow unraveling. It meant empty jars, silent mills, gaunt animals, and the dreadful humiliation of a father standing in a field that would not answer his labor. This is where many readers judge Israel too quickly, and in doing so, they miss the terror of the moment. The test was not abstract theology floating high above the earth. The test was whether a people formed by miracle could trust God when His provision no longer appeared in their hands every sunrise, but seemed hidden in the sky, delayed in the clouds, and buried in the soil. That kind of faith is harder. It asks a man to sow before he sees. It asks a mother to pray while the ground still looks dry. It asks an entire nation to believe that the invisible God is no less present in uncertainty than He was in spectacle. And this is where survival itself became a spiritual battlefield. Israel stood in a land where every harvest would preach something to them, where every delayed rainfall could whisper doubt into the heart, where every season of waiting could make practical fear sound wiser than covenant faith. The Jordan was behind them now. Before them lay fields, skies, and a question that would not leave. Baal was not merely an idol standing in carved silence on a hill. He was not a childish superstition preserved by ignorant villagers afraid of thunder. That is the mistake modern readers make when they look backward with contempt instead of clarity. They imagine Israel falling for something crude, something obviously hollow, something no serious people could mistake for wisdom. But Baal endured because he was woven into a complete system, one that touched the field, the family, the marketplace, the sanctuary, and the deepest anxieties of daily survival. He was not just worshipped, he was integrated. In Canaan, religion did not live at the edges of life. It sat at the center of the village economy. The gods were not distant abstractions meant only to explain the mysteries of heaven. They were understood as active powers governing the most urgent matters on earth: rain, fertility, livestock, grain, childbirth, harvest, survival. Every blessing that kept a household alive was folded into this structure. Baal was said to command the skies. Asherah was tied to fertility and fruitfulness. Together they formed not simply a pantheon, but a functioning worldview that taught people how to think about cause and effect, risk and reward, fear and provision. And here is what made the system so seductive. It was transactional. The arrangement seemed clear. If the land needed rain, then the god of rain must be honored. If the womb needed fruitfulness, then the power behind fertility must be invoked. If the harvest was uncertain, then ritual became an investment. Offerings were not random acts of devotion. They were premiums paid into a spiritual economy. Grain, to vine, oil, animals, feasts, bodily acts, public ceremonies. These were all treated as contributions to a system that promised returns. Do what is required, and the gods will respond. Neglect the ritual, and the heavens may close. That is not chaos. That is structure. Priests oversaw it. Shrines maintained it. Communities funded it. Generations inherited it. Fathers taught sons which altars mattered. Villages learned which rites belonged to which seasons. Agriculture and worship moved together like threads, twisted into the same cord. When men sowed seed, they were not merely farming. They were participating in a worldview that told them the land itself could be negotiated with through divine exchange. So when Israel entered that world, they did not encounter paganism in its weakest form. They encountered it in its most persuasive form, as a practical order for life. Their neighbors were not inviting them into philosophical rebellion. They were inviting them into a system that appeared to work. The local farmer could point to the soil, the vine, the lambing season, the children running through his courtyard, and say without embarrassment, "This is why we do what we do." That kind of testimony is difficult to resist when your own future feels fragile. And that is why the danger ran so deep. Baal did not compete with Yahweh first at the level of theology. He competed at the level of utility. He offered visible process, measurable ritual, and the illusion that blessing could be managed. He gave anxious people a mechanism. He gave frightened households a script. He gave uncertainty a method. This is what Israel was facing. Not merely a false god, but a whole architecture of exchange. A religious economy dressed as common sense and backed by the pressure of an entire land. And once a system like that is accepted as normal, the next question is no longer whether it is true, but why anyone would dare live without it. In 1929, on the northern coast of Syria, a farmer's plough struck stone beneath the earth and tore open a silence that had lasted more than 3,000 years. What lay buried there was not merely a ruined city, it was a witness. Beneath the dust stood the remains of Ugarit, a Bronze Age port once powerful, once cultured, once alive with commerce, ritual, and kingship, then swallowed by time and forgotten by empires. French archaeologists came, and with their spades they began to uncover not only walls and tombs, but a world. Among the ruins they found clay tablets inscribed with a script no one immediately recognized. Line after line, wedge after wedge, the voice of a vanished civilization waited in fragments. Years passed before scholars could decipher the language. And when at last the text began to yield its meaning, something extraordinary emerged. These were not random records. They were hymns, myths, liturgies, royal documents, sacred narratives. They were the preserved imagination of Canaanite religion, in its own words. And at the center of that world stood Baal. This mattered more than many first realized. Until then, many people knew Baal primarily through the denunciations of the Bible. They knew him as the rival condemned by prophets, the false god exposed by judgment, the idol that seduced Israel. But Ugarit allowed historians to hear the other side, not the accusation of his enemies, but the self-understanding of his worshippers. It was as though the curtain had been pulled back. Baal was no longer a vague figure looming in the shadows of Scripture. He came into focus with startling detail, clothed in titles, stories, weapons, mountains, and cosmic authority. He was not imagined as a village trinket. He was Baal Hadad, Lord of storm and thunder, Master of lightning, ruler of rain and dew. He was portrayed as the one who rides upon the clouds, a title of terrifying grandeur in a world where clouds meant survival. He held the bolt in one hand and the mace in the other, not as decoration, but as signs of dominion. He was enthroned above the earth on Mount Zaphon, the sacred height near the modern Syria-Turkey border, where the heavens seemed near enough to command. To the people who sang his praises, he was not one god among many in a harmless pantheon. He was force, weather, kingship, and fertility gathered into one image of active rule. Do you see the significance? Israel was not being tempted by nonsense. It was being confronted by a rival story of reality, a rival interpretation of sky and season, life and death. Baal did not merely promise blessing. He offered an explanation for the world. He gave names to thunder, meaning to rainfall, and ritual shape to the uncertainty of nature. He spoke to a civilization that needed the heavens to answer. And that is why the excavation of Ugarit matters so deeply. It shows that Baal's power in the ancient imagination was not built on emptiness alone, but on coherence, symbolism, poetry, and a terrifying intimacy with the fears of ordinary people. He was false, yes, but he was not simplistic. He was seductive because he seemed to fit the world people could see. Once his face emerged from those tablets, The conflict surrounding him became sharper. For now the question was no longer simply why Israel fell, but what kind of God they believed they were turning toward. Baal's power over the imagination of the ancient world did not rest merely on titles or statues. It rested on story. And stories, when they explain suffering, survival, and the changing face of the earth, can become more persuasive than armies. The mythology surrounding Baal gave his worshippers something every frightened civilization longs for, a pattern. It told them why the land flourished, why it failed, why the heavens opened, and why they sometimes remained shut like bronze above a dying field. In the sacred texts preserved from Canaan, Baal is not a passive figure seated far away from human struggle. He is a god in motion, a god entangled in cosmic conflict. First, he battles Yam, the god of the sea and chaos, and establishes his rule. But victory does not end the drama. Another enemy rises, darker and more terrifying than storm or flood. It is Mut, the god of death, sterility, and the devouring grave. Against Mut, even Baal descends into the shadows. And there, in the deep place beneath life, Baal is swallowed. When Baal dies, the world suffers. That is the key. The rains stop, the ground hardens, crops wither where they stand. The fruitful earth becomes thin and cracked beneath the sun. The fertility of the land appears to retreat into silence. This was not simply a poetic image in the ancient mind. It was a theological explanation for drought itself. Summer came. The skies closed. The fields trembled under heat. And the myth said, Baal has fallen. The god of life has been overcome. Death now reigns over the land. But the story did not end in the grave. Anat, Baal's fierce sister and consort, goes searching for him, confronts the power of death. And in time Baal is restored. He rises. He returns. And when he returns, the rains come with him. The clouds gather again. The soil softens. Green pushes through the ground. The vineyards revive. The grain stands up. The earth, which seemed sentenced to barrenness, begins once more to breathe. Do you understand what this meant to the farmer, the shepherd, the mother watching empty jars in the house? This was not myth kept at a safe distance in the minds of priests. This was weather turned into worship. This was agriculture clothed in divine drama. Every dry summer and every returning rain seemed to reenact Baal's descent and return. The cycle of nature was interpreted as the cycle of the god. And once that connection was accepted, ritual became urgent. If Baal's rising meant the return of life, then the people must participate. They must invoke, appeal, feast, mourn, and perform what their tradition required so that the divine pattern would continue and the land would not fail them. That is why Baal became more than an idol. He became seasonal hope itself. A god who dies and rises with the land, speaks directly to a people whose lives rise and fall with the harvest. He appears intimate with the earth, synchronized with the rhythms of seed time and drought, woven into the visible drama of the year. To those who believed in him, Baal was not just a religious figure. He was the explanation for why autumn clouds mattered, why fields revived, Why famine sometimes loosened its grip. He was the promise that barrenness was temporary, that death in the soil could be reversed, that life would return if the cycle was honored. And once a god becomes the interpreter of the seasons, the next question is no longer whether he exists, but whether anyone dares ignore him when the sky begins to close. The Bible did not treat Baal as a harmless relic of foreign religion, nor as a mistake too small to deserve sustained attention. It confronted him directly, deliberately, and with stunning precision. That is what makes the conflict so profound. Scripture did not merely condemn Baal as false. It entered the battlefield of symbols, titles, claims, and identity. And there it declared that everything Baal pretended to be, the God of Israel already was in truth. This is the part many readers miss. The biblical writers were not naive observers, living in isolation from the religious language of the ancient world. They knew exactly what Baal represented. They knew the titles used in his praise, the fears that gave him influence, the hopes attached to his name. And rather than avoiding those claims, they reached into that very vocabulary and took it away from him. One title in particular reveals the force of that confrontation. Baal was celebrated in Canaanite worship as the rider on the clouds, a name heavy with majesty in a world where clouds meant rain, and rain meant life. To call a god the rider of the clouds was to say that he governed the sky itself, that he rode above the earth with power over storm, fertility, and survival. Yet in the Psalms, that title appears not as an honor reserved for Baal, but as a declaration about Yahweh. The biblical writers did not borrow that phrase carelessly. They seized it like a banner taken from an enemy in battle. They reassigned it to the Lord as an act of theological warfare. Do you see what that means? It means Scripture was not content to say, Baal is Bud. It said something far more devastating. Baal is an impostor, the power his worshippers fear, the authority they imagine, the dominion they attribute to him over clouds and storm and rain. Those things do not belong to him at all. They belong to Yahweh. The Bible did not leave Baal standing in a separate sphere as though he were a lesser but still functioning rival. It invaded his territory and announced that the throne he claimed was never his. That is why this conflict was never merely about statues or altars. It was about names, identity, kingship, and the right to define reality itself. Who sends the rain? Who commands the heavens? Who rules the storm? Who deserves the trust of a nation trembling before drought and hunger? Baal's worshippers answered with one story. Scripture answered with another, and it answered without hesitation. Yet Baal's strategy did not depend on forcing Israel to make a dramatic public renunciation of the Lord. His strength lay in something more subtle and therefore more dangerous. He did not demand immediate replacement. He invited supplementation. Keep Yahweh. Yes, but add Baal, where life feels fragile. Honor the covenant. Certainly. But when the fields are at risk and the clouds delay, make room for something visible, local, and practical. Hedge your bets, guard your future, secure the harvest. And that is why the confrontation in Scripture burns with such intensity. The issue was not only whether Israel would deny God outright. The issue was whether they would divide their trust, splitting their devotion between the living Lord and a system that promised controllable results. Once that temptation entered the heart, the war was no longer confined to public theology. It moved into memory, habit, worship, and the quiet reasoning of an anxious people. After the death of Joshua, Israel did not collapse all at once in some dramatic rebellion that could be easily named and cleanly condemned. The fall came faster than many expect, yet quieter than most imagine. A single generation passed, and the people who had inherited the memory of the Jordan crossing, the downfall of Jericho, and the victories granted by the hand of God were replaced by sons and daughters who knew the language of covenant only as an echo. The book of Judges speaks with terrifying simplicity. Another generation arose who did not know the Lord, nor the works he had done for Israel. And from that forgetting came the first great fracture. But notice carefully what kind of fracture it was. Israel did not wake one morning and formally renounce Yahweh. There was no nationwide declaration that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had been abandoned. There was something more subtle, more respectable, and therefore more dangerous. The people kept the name of the Lord, yet they began to make room for other powers beside him. They did not replace worship. They diluted it. They did not tear down the language of faith. They filled it with divided trust. This is how compromise usually enters a nation, and this is how it enters a soul. The people still knew where the tabernacle stood. They still remembered feasts, laws, sacred days, inherited words, but memory without devotion becomes ceremony, and ceremony without exclusive loyalty becomes a shell. So while Yahweh remained in their vocabulary, Baal entered their habits. The Lord was still honored in moments of national identity, in stories, in formal acts, in the broad outline of who they believed themselves to be. But Baal began to occupy the nervous places of life, the fields, the weather, the private fears, the anxious calculations made when clouds delayed and families counted the cost of another failed season. And to the human mind, that arrangement felt reasonable. Why reject the God of the covenant when you could simply add the God of practical necessity? Why deny the Lord who brought your fathers out of Egypt when you could also honor the local power said to govern rain, fertility, and harvest? Why choose one altar when life felt safer with two? The reasoning was not openly defiant. It was cautious. It was adaptive. It was dressed in the language of prudence. A man could still say he believed in Yahweh while bowing at another shrine just in case. A household could still preserve the memory of Israel while kneeling to the customs of the land around them. That is what made the corruption so severe. Divided worship always imagines itself to be moderate. It calls itself balanced. It calls itself wise. But heaven calls it treachery. Because the living God does not enter covenant as one option among many. He does not stand beside rival altars, waiting to be consulted when the others fail. He demands the whole heart, and anything less is not shared loyalty. It is spiritual adultery in its earliest form. So Israel drifted, not first through hatred of God, but through the slow logic of addition. Yahweh for identity, Baal for security, Yahweh for history, Baal for harvest, Yahweh for the soul, Baal for survival. And once a people begins to separate life that way, Once sacred trust is split between the invisible Lord and visible systems of control. The corruption spreads quietly through everything. Soon, the divided heart would no longer hide itself in theory. It would begin to take shape in the land itself. Across the land of Israel, Baal did not remain confined to foreign temples or distant cities. He spread through ordinary geography. He moved into hillsides, village paths, groves of trees, and the edges of daily life until the landscape itself began to preach another theology. The Bible calls them high places, but the phrase can sound too harmless to modern ears. These were not scenic overlooks where people happened to pray. They were a rival network of worship sites, scattered across the nation like nerves through a body, each one feeding the same corrupted pulse. On the hilltops stood stone altars blackened by fire. Beside them rose sacred pillars, upright stones planted as visible signs of divine presence. Wooden poles carved to represent Asherah were fixed into the ground, not as decoration, but as symbols of fertility, sexuality, and productive power. Priests attached to these local shrines maintained the rites, interpreted the customs, and guided the people through ceremonies that promised to bend heaven toward earthly need. These places were near, accessible, woven into village routine. A man did not need to journey far. He needed only to climb the nearest slope. That nearness mattered. False worship always grows stronger when it becomes convenient. A distant command can be resisted. A local altar becomes familiar. Children see it on the horizon. Farmers pass it on the road. Families hear songs from it during feast days. The extraordinary becomes ordinary through repetition. What begins as compromise soon settles into custom, and custom hardens into identity. Before long, the shrine on the hill no longer appears as a violation of covenant. It feels like part of the land itself. And what happened there was not spiritually neutral. The rituals were built around one obsessive desire: fertility, fertility of womb, fertility of herd, fertility of field, fertility of vine, fertility of oil, fertility of every earthly system upon which survival depended. Feasting and drinking surrounded the ceremonies. Sacrifices were offered as exchanges. In some places, sexual rites were performed as acts of sympathetic magic, based on the belief that if human bodies enacted fertility, the god would answer by making the soil fruitful. The logic was grotesque, but it was internally consistent. Life begets life. Union awakens abundance. Desire becomes a tool of agriculture. So the altar was never merely an altar. It was a mechanism, a transaction point, a place where people came not primarily to adore, but to secure outcomes. That is the corruption at the center of Baal's system. Worship was reduced to leverage. Devotion became payment. Sacrifice became a contract. You give Baal your offering, your body, your feast, your blood, your loyalty to the ritual, and Baal gives you rain. The exchange was frighteningly simple, and because it was simple, it spread. This is why the danger ran deeper than theology alone. These shrines trained the heart to believe that blessing could be purchased, controlled, activated by performance. They taught Israel to seek visible ritual rather than living obedience, immediate assurance rather than covenant trust. A people called to walk with the invisible God slowly learned instead to manage their fear through repeated acts at tangible sites. And once those acts are repeated across a nation, once the hills themselves are crowned with rival altars, the land stops being merely occupied. It becomes catechized. Every hill begins to teach. Every pillar begins to testify. Every grove becomes a classroom of compromise. Israel was no longer wrestling only with temptation in the abstract. Temptation had taken architectural form, and the nation would now begin to live inside its consequences. In the days before Ahab, Israel had already learned the habit of compromise. The people had grown accustomed to divided loyalties, to public reverence for the Lord and private accommodations to the gods of the land. But under Ahab, what had once lived in the shadows stepped into the throne room. What had been tolerated at the margins was invited into the center, and with Jezebel, compromise ceased to be a weakness of the people alone. It became policy. It became power. It became a campaign. Ahab, king of the northern kingdom, did not merely marry a foreign woman. He joined himself to a system. Jezebel, daughter of Baal, king of the Sidonians, entered Israel not as a passive queen, preserving the customs of her homeland in private chambers. She came with conviction, with structure, with the confidence of one who did not believe she was borrowing space, but taking it. She was not content to survive within Israel. She intended to reshape it. This is the difference between private sin and public revolution. One corrupts by influence. The other corrupts by institution. Under Jezebel's hand, Baal worship was no longer confined to scattered altars on remote heights. It received royal endorsement. It was funded from the treasury. Its prophets were not wandering local figures serving village shrines. They were gathered, organized, fed at the queen's table, sustained by the machinery of the state itself. That detail matters. When falsehood is fed by the palace, it no longer begs for survival. It begins to legislate reality. It begins to teach the nation what is normal. And Israel learned quickly. A temple for Baal rose in Samaria, the capital city. Think of the symbolism. This was not a hidden shrine tucked away from the eyes of the faithful. It stood where authority stood. It proclaimed that the issue was no longer whether Baal had a place in the land, but whether Yahweh had one left. The queen had not simply added another god to Israel's crowded spiritual life. She had elevated Baal into the public language of legitimacy, into the architecture of national identity, into the visible grammar of kingship itself. At the same time, the prophets of the Lord were hunted. That is always how conquest reveals itself. False worship does not remain satisfied with coexistence for long. Once it tastes power, it demands silence from whatever contradicts it. Jezebel understood that the God of Israel could not be fully displaced as long as his voice remained alive in the mouths of his prophets. So the prophets were cut down, pursued, driven into hiding. Men who carried the word of the living God were forced into caves, sustained by secret mercy, while the servants of Baal ate in comfort beneath royal protection. Can you feel the inversion? The worship of the Lord, once the covenant foundation of the nation, was now treated like a threat to public order. The cult of Baal, once a rival intrusion, wore the garments of establishment. The land promised to Abraham was being trained to forget Abraham's God. This was no longer a battle between two religious options, presented fairly before the conscience of the people. The scales had been seized. The throne had taken sides. The nation stood under a canopy of organized seduction and managed fear, where political alliance, state-sponsored religion, and spiritual violence moved together as one. And when a kingdom reaches that depth of corruption, when the altars of falsehood are protected by crowns and the truth must hide to stay alive, the silence before judgment grows heavy. Then, into a kingdom swollen with spectacle, compromise, and royal defiance, there stepped a man with no visible credentials, strong enough to match the scale of the corruption before him. No army marched behind him. No court announced him. No pedigree was paraded to make his words respectable in the eyes of power. He emerged from Tishbe, from obscurity, carrying nothing that kings value and everything heaven requires. His name was Elijah, and when he spoke, he did not offer counsel. He did not negotiate. He did not plead for reform in careful tones suited to palace ears. He declared judgment. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word. That sentence fell upon Israel like a blade. It was not merely a prophecy of bad weather. It was a direct assault on the central claim of Baal. For if Baal was Lord of storm, master of clouds, ruler of rain and dew, then a drought, announced in the name of Yahweh, was not simply a national hardship. It was a public trial. The skies themselves would bear witness. Heaven would testify which God truly ruled above the land. And heaven closed. Days passed, then weeks, then months. The fields began to harden beneath the sun. Springs shrank. Streams weakened. Dust gathered where green should have risen. The first stage of drought often deceives the proud because it arrives quietly. Men tell themselves the rains are only delayed. Farmers scan the horizon and repeat familiar hopes. Officials speak calmly. Priests continue their rites. The machinery of denial grinds on because no one wishes to admit how near disaster may already be. But drought is patient, and judgment does not need to shout in order to terrify. As the months turned, the earth itself began to preach against Baal. Crops failed in silence. Livestock weakened. The reservoirs of confidence, first public and then private, began to empty. What had once been discussed as a temporary strain became a crisis no rhetoric could hide. Mothers counted stores more carefully. Men walked farther for water. The strong grew lean. The poor began to feel the edge of famine first, as they always do. Villages learned to fear the sky, not because it thundered, but because it did not. And all the while, Baal said nothing. That silence was devastating, for every day without rain became an argument sharper than any sermon. The God who claimed power over storm could not release a cloud. The Lord of fertility could not preserve the land from barrenness. The patron of agricultural confidence had become the witness of agricultural ruin. His altars still stood. His priests still invoked him. His rituals still demanded performance. But the heavens, which were supposed to answer his devotees, remained shut like bronze over a dying nation. Do you see the severity of this moment? The crisis was not accidental hardship. It was theological exposure written into the dust of the ground. God was dismantling a lie, using the very element Baal claimed to control. Every cracked field, every withered stalk, every empty brook became part of a verdict. The nation had trusted in a rival power for life, and now life itself was being withdrawn from the land in order to reveal the emptiness of that trust. 3.5 years is long enough for illusion to rot. By then, the drought was no longer just a condition. It was a reckoning suspended over the kingdom, waiting for the moment when denial would finally be dragged into the open. Mount Carmel was not chosen as a stage for religious theater. It was chosen as a courtroom. There, before a starving nation and beneath a silent sky, the question that had haunted Israel through years of drought was summoned into the open, where it could no longer hide behind custom, emotion, or political power. Elijah stood before the people and spoke with the clarity of a prophet who had no interest in managing their confusion gently. How long will you go limping between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. It was not merely a rebuke. It was an indictment. Israel's sin was not uncertainty born from lack of evidence. It was divided allegiance maintained in defiance of evidence already given. The people answered him not a word. That silence was itself a confession. They had learned how to live in contradiction. They had become skilled in divided worship, fluent in compromise, capable of bowing in more than one direction while pretending not to notice the fracture in their own souls. Carmel would not permit that fracture to remain hidden. Elijah proposed terms so simple that no manipulation could survive them. 2 bulls, 2 altars, 2 claims to divine power. No human hand would light the fire. The God who answered by fire would be known as God. What followed was not spectacle for its own sake. It was exposure. The prophets of Baal went first, and there were many of them. A swollen company of institutional religion, standing in public confidence before a single man who appeared to possess nothing but obedience. They prepared the sacrifice, arranged the wood, and began to cry out. Morning stretched toward noon. "O Baal, answer us," they shouted. Their voices rose over the mountain ridge with all the urgency of men trying to wake a God who could not hear. They danced around the altar. They leaped. They exhausted themselves in movement, sound, and repetition. But the heavens remained shut. The altar remained cold. The sacrifice remained untouched. Then Elijah began to mock them, and his mockery cut with surgical precision. Cry aloud, for he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or relieving himself, or on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep and must be awakened. This was no careless taunt. It was theological humiliation. Elijah threw Baal's own mythology back at his servants. The God who supposedly ruled life was behaving exactly like a fiction absent, passive, unreachable, trapped in the helplessness his own story assigned to him. The prophets escalated. They cut themselves with swords and lances until blood ran down their bodies. Their frenzy deepened into self-destruction. The altar demanded more, as false gods always do. More noise, more pain, more performance. Yet Scripture records the verdict with devastating economy. There was no voice. No one answered. No one paid attention. Then Elijah called the people near. He repaired the broken altar of the Lord with 12 stones, one for each tribe, as though rebuilding in symbol the unity Israel had shattered in spirit. He laid the wood, placed the sacrifice, and then did something utterly unreasonable unless he knew the living God was about to act. He ordered water poured over everything once, twice, 3 times, until the offering was drenched, the wood soaked, and the trench around the altar filled. Every natural possibility was stripped away. No trick remained. No hidden ember could be blamed. And then Elijah prayed. No frenzy, no bleeding, no chanting, only a direct appeal to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, asking that the people might know that the Lord alone is God and that he was turning their hearts back again. The answer came immediately. Fire fell from heaven and consumed the sacrifice. The wood, the stones, the dust, and even the water in the trench. It was not enough merely to ignite. It devoured, it judged, it revealed. And in that moment, on that mountain, Baal was not merely defeated, he was emptied before the eyes of the nation. The fire had fallen, the sky had answered, the drought had broken. If there had ever been a moment when Israel should have been cured forever of its fascination with Baal, it was that one. On Carmel, the nation had seen with its own eyes what generations before them had begged to understand. Baal did not speak. Baal did not move. Baal did not send fire. Baal did not command the storm. The Lord alone answered, and he answered in a way so absolute that no honest witness could mistake what had happened. The altar of deception stood exposed. The heavens had rendered their verdict. And yet Israel returned. That is one of the most disturbing truths in all of sacred history. The people did not turn back because the evidence had been weak. They did not drift because the miracle had been small or unclear. They returned after certainty. They returned after spectacle. They returned after fire and rain had both testified against the God they could not seem to quit. That is what makes this story so unsettling. It proves that idolatry is not sustained merely by ignorance. Sometimes it survives in full view of truth. The human heart can witness what is undeniable and still crave what is familiar. For a time, the shock of Carmel must have passed through the land like thunder. Men who had stood on that mountain would have repeated the story in villages and courts. Mothers would have told their children about the fire. Farmers would have remembered the rain. The name of Baal had been humiliated in public. But memory, when it does not become obedience, fades into story. And story, when it no longer governs the heart, becomes background noise. Soon enough, the same pressures returned, the waiting skies, the anxious fields, the old habits of compromise, the inherited instincts that kept drawing Israel back toward whatever felt immediate, manageable, and useful. That is why the prophet spoke of Baal worship not as an intellectual mistake, but as marital betrayal. God commanded Hosea to live the pain in his own body. He was told to marry a woman who would prove unfaithful, leave, chase other lovers, and wound the covenant again and again. Why? Because Israel was doing exactly that to God. This was not mere ritual confusion. It was a broken marriage. The people had been loved, rescued, clothed, fed, and bound to the Lord by covenant mercy. And still, they ran after other lovers who promised them what they thought they needed faster, easier, and with less surrender. Jeremiah saw the same horror and described it in the language of public shame. Ezekiel spoke even more sharply, portraying Israel as one who took every gift received from God and laid those gifts at the feet of strangers. The issue was never that Baal was truly greater. The issue was that Baal was easier. He demanded performance. And performance can be measured. Show up. Offer the ritual. Complete the exchange. Go home believing the matter is settled. But the Lord asked for what terrified them most. The whole heart. Not ceremony alone, but trust. Not transaction, but relationship. Not controlled religion, but surrender. And surrender is harder than sacrifice. That is why miracles alone did not heal Israel. The fire on the mountain could expose a false god, but it could not, by itself, uproot the craving for manageable devotion. The rain could return, but the divided heart could still wander. Beneath the outward altars stood an inward addiction, and until that deeper wound was named, the people would continue doing what wounded them most, turning from the one who had proven himself faithful, back toward the lie that kept calling them by name. The addiction to Baal did not remain a private corruption hidden in village shrines and household habits. It ripened into national collapse. What began as compromise in the heart eventually entered the bloodstream of the kingdom. And once it did, the consequences were no longer confined to altars on lonely hills. They spread into thrones, into laws, into the temple itself, into the fate of an entire people. False worship never stays small. Given enough time, it demands a body to inhabit, and that body was Israel. In the northern kingdom, the descent became explicit. The covenant was not merely neglected, it was steadily exchanged for the customs of the surrounding nations. The people did not stumble into ruin by accident. They were warned. Prophets spoke. Judgments came and went. Opportunities for repentance were offered again and again. But each return was shallow, each reform temporary, each awakening followed by another drift back toward the same poisoned center. Baal had become more than a cult. He had become instinct. He had become habit sanctified by repetition. The people no longer had to be persuaded afresh each generation. The corruption had learned to reproduce itself. And so the northern kingdom hollowed out from within. 2 Kings states the cause with terrible clarity. They forsook the commandments of the Lord and followed vanity until they themselves became vain. That is one of the most frightening judgments in Scripture. Not merely that people worship emptiness, but that in time they are shaped into the image of what they adore. A nation that gives itself to falsehood becomes false. A people who bow before lifeless gods lose the weight of life within themselves. When Assyria finally came in 722 BC, the military defeat was only the visible surface of a much deeper disaster. The empire scattered the 10 northern tribes, carried them away, and dissolved their political existence. But the kingdom had been disintegrating long before the Assyrian armies crossed its borders. The conquest on the battlefield only completed what idolatry had already begun in the soul. Yet Judah, the southern kingdom, did not learn enough from the ruin of its brother. There the infection deepened under kings who should have known better. Among them stood Manasseh, whose reign stretched long and dark across the line of David. He did not merely tolerate abomination in the land, he brought it into the sanctuary. Altars rose where holiness should have governed. An Asherah image was set within the temple itself, as though the house built for the name of the Lord could be made to host the very corruption that had defiled the nation for generations. The valley of Hinnom became a place of horror, where children were offered in fire. Understand what had happened. The transactional logic of Baal, once justified as practical religion for rain and fertility, had now reached its most monstrous conclusion. When worship is severed from truth and surrendered to appetite, it will always demand more blood than its servants expected to give. Even reform, when it came, could not fully heal the wound. Josiah tore down high places, shattered pillars, burned Asherah poles, defiled the sites of false worship, and sought to cleanse the land with rare courage. But external destruction could not instantly restore what centuries of corruption had consumed. The structures fell faster than the cravings that built them. After his death, the old impulses returned with frightening speed. The nation had learned how to rebuild sin because sin had long since become native to its instincts. Then judgment came at last with fire and iron. Babylon breached Jerusalem, shattered its defenses, stripped its treasures, and burned the temple Solomon had built. Gold blackened, cedar cracked, sacred courts filled with ruin. The house, once saturated with glory, became a monument of smoke, and in that devastation, the full cost of Israel's long surrender stood exposed. Baal had not merely stolen their affection, he had helped carry a nation to the edge where even the holy place could no longer stand. And the silence left behind was heavier than the flames. Exile was not merely the punishment of a rebellious nation. It was the severe mercy of a God who had watched his people wound themselves for centuries and would no longer allow the sickness to remain untreated. By the time Jerusalem fell, idolatry was no longer an occasional failure or a passing corruption. It had become a pattern so deeply embedded in Israel's instincts that miracles had not uprooted it. Reforms had not outlasted it, and judgment after judgment had not permanently broken its hold. What remained was not a surface infection. It was something buried in the marrow. So God chose not to soothe it. He cut. When Babylon came, the loss was total enough to feel unbearable. The city was broken. The walls were breached. The temple was reduced to ash. The kingly line sat humiliated. The people were dragged from the land, promised to their fathers, and carried into a foreign empire under the shadow of another people's gods. Everything that had once defined Israel's existence in visible form seemed stripped away at once: homeland, monarchy, sanctuary, harvest, familiar roads, remembered hills, the rhythms of feast and field, the emotional geography of belonging. It looked like destruction because it was destruction, but it was not destruction without purpose. Exile was surgery. That is what makes it so difficult to understand unless you are willing to see mercy wearing the face of devastation. God was not merely reacting in anger, he was doing what lesser love refuses to do. He was removing his people from the very environment that had fed their addiction. In the land of Canaan, every hill could become a temptation. Every anxious season a whisper toward compromise. Every harvest cycle a trigger for divided trust. The ecosystem itself had become spiritually diseased. The people had learned to associate survival with the wrong altar so thoroughly that as long as they remained immersed in that atmosphere, they kept returning to it. So God took the land away. In Babylon, there were no familiar, high places, calling them back into inherited compromise. No local shrines stood at the edge of their villages, promising control over rainfall on Canaanite soil. No agricultural panic could drive them to Baal in the old way, because they were no longer living inside the old structure that had trained them to think like that. The separation was brutal, but brutality was required because gentler measures had failed. Sometimes, what looks like ruin is the only doorway left to healing. And healing did come, though not cheaply. Years passed beneath foreign skies. The people learned to weep by the rivers of Babylon, to remember Zion in grief, to speak of covenant not as inherited possession, but as aching hope. Their identity was purified in the furnace of loss. What prosperity had not taught them, deprivation did. What miracles had not secured, displacement carved into memory. The absence itself became instruction, stripped of illusion. They began to understand that the God they had treated as negotiable was the only one they could not live without. And when at last they returned, something remarkable had changed. They came back wounded, chastened, diminished in power, yet altered at the level of desire. They still carried weaknesses, still struggled with hypocrisy and hardness in other forms. But the long seduction of Baal had been broken. The old obsession had lost its hold. The knife had gone deep enough. Exile had done what spectacle could not. It had torn the patient away from the poison. And in the terrible wisdom of God, the wound itself became the means by which the deeper sickness finally began to die. Baal is gone from the ancient hills. His carved poles have rotted. His temples lie broken beneath layers of dust and stone. Archaeologists catalogue his ruins. Historians reconstruct his myths. His priests are dead. His altars are rubble. In that sense, Baal has been finished for a very long time. The old name no longer commands nations. No crowds gather beneath his banner, expecting thunder from his hand. History has buried the figure. But history did not bury the pattern. That is the danger. Baal was never powerful merely because he had a name, an image, or a shrine. He was powerful because he offered a system of exchange that fit the instincts of the fallen human heart. Give devotion, get results. Perform the ritual, secure the blessing. Make the offering, control the outcome. That structure did not die when the ancient world ended. It survived the collapse of cities, the burning of temples, the rise and fall of empires, because it did not live first in stone. It lived in desire, and desire, when it is ruled by fear, is always ready to build the same altar again under a different name. Look carefully, and you will see it. Baal promised prosperity, and modern man still kneels wherever prosperity is treated as salvation. The altar now may stand in an office lit long after midnight. It may stand in a calendar with no room left for breath. It may stand in the obsession with numbers, growth, promotion, accumulation, and the private conviction that financial security is the highest good. Men no longer speak of rain for crops, yet they still give their strength, their health, their marriages, their children, and their peace to whatever promises survival through success. The vocabulary has changed. The worship has not. Baal promised visible, immediate results, and that hunger still rules countless souls. That spirit appears wherever faith is reduced to transaction. I prayed. So where is the answer? I gave. So where is the reward? I obeyed. So why has blessing delayed? Listen closely, and you can hear the old liturgy beneath the modern phrasing. It is the same ancient impulse, dressed in respectable language. I have performed. Now, heaven owes me. What matters is not communion, but return. Not surrender, but leverage. Not trust, but outcome. Baal promised belonging too. He was the religion of the village. The shrine everyone knew. The practice no one questioned. And that pattern remains wherever conformity becomes more powerful than conviction. People still bow because everyone around them bows. They still fear being strange, excluded, laughed at, left behind. So, they maintain the acceptable altar, the admired altar, the one that keeps them safely inside the tribe. The crowd still has priests. The crowd still has rituals. The crowd still punishes difference. That is why the story remains painfully current. Israel was not foolish because it wanted help. It was vulnerable because it wanted control. Baal seemed easier than trusting the unseen God. He seemed faster, clearer, more practical, more responsive to immediate fear. And that is exactly why modern hearts still drift toward his architecture. Human beings still prefer gods they can manage, systems they can measure, devotions that appear to guarantee results. So do not imagine this story ended in the ruins of Canaan. The idol's face may be gone, but its logic is still breathing. The real question is not whether you would have bowed before Baal on an ancient hilltop. The real question is far closer, far sharper, and far less comfortable. What kind of relationship your heart is actually seeking when it reaches for something greater than itself. In the end, the deepest issue was never rain, harvest, drought, kings, shrines, or even the name of Baal itself. Beneath every altar, beneath every compromise, beneath every act of divided worship, there was a more searching question. What kind of God did Israel actually want? Did they want the living God in his holiness, freedom, and covenant love? Or did they want a God who could be managed? Did they want communion? Or did they want control? That is where the story reaches its true center. Baal offered transaction. He offered a religion of exchange. Bring the sacrifice. Perform the rite. Complete the ceremony, and expect the return. It was measurable, visible, immediate. It allowed the worshipper to imagine that blessing could be activated by correct behavior, that divine favor could be handled like a contract, that heaven itself could be persuaded into service through ritual precision. That kind of religion is attractive because it feels safe. It places the mystery of life inside a system the human hand believes it can operate. But the God of Israel would not be reduced to that. He did not call his people into covenant so that he might become their supplier on demand. He did not reveal his name merely to become a more powerful version of the same pagan instinct. He wanted something far more intimate, and therefore far more frightening. He wanted the heart, not a performance, but trust, not a calculated offering made to secure results, but a living relationship grounded in love, faithfulness, surrender, and presence. This is why the prophets spoke as they did. They did not describe Israel's sin only as error. They described it as adultery. Because covenant with God is not the language of market exchange. It is the language of belonging. Hosea gives this truth some of its tenderest expression. God declares that the day will come when his people will no longer relate to him as a master in the corrupt sense of fearful transaction, but as a husband. The distinction is everything. A master can be served outwardly while the heart remains distant. A husband is either loved or betrayed. God was not asking Israel for better ritual management. He was calling them back to covenant nearness. And this is why Baal, for all his promises, was always a counterfeit. He could offer the illusion of results, but never the reality of communion. He could demand ritual, but he could not give life. He could imitate the pattern of death and rising in myth, tied to seasons and cycles, but he could never break death itself. He could never heal the human heart that kept building altars out of fear. Then history moved toward its greater answer. Christ came not as a seasonal God of recurring myth, but as the true and living Son who entered death in history and rose once for all. In him, everything false worship pretended to offer was fulfilled in truth. Not a cycle, but victory. Not an annual drama, but a finished work. Not a bargain, but redemption. Not a God to manipulate, but a Savior who loves, pursues, and gives himself. That is the final wound this story opens in every listener. God does not want to be your transaction. He does not want your rituals while your trust belongs elsewhere. He does not want a divided heart that visits him while secretly kneeling at another altar. He wants what he has always wanted, a people who know him, love him, and remain with him, whether the rain falls quickly or not at all. Because in the end, the great battle was never only about which God could send the storm. It was about whether the human heart would settle for an exchange or surrender itself to a covenant of love.